You have likely seen our next guest's name on the byline of our best newspaper and magazine articles. He was born in Hong Kong, but became an acute observer and chronicler of life in Vancouver. He is surely one of the hardest workers in his profession. He's also written 5 books, teaches creative writing at the University of British Columbia, and he's learning the art of being able to live without sleeping as a new father. Please welcome Kevin Chong.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Sam. One thing I learned from this experience is you never say no to a white guy who can speak Cantonese, because they're like unicorns. When Sam introduced, when we were discussing this at night, he mentioned his introduction for me. And one of the things he mentioned was my Wikipedia entry. And Wikipedia is very famous for letting anyone edit it. And it sometimes allows friends who are waging prank wars with you to edit it to say that you're a show dog handler, a jazz musician named Butterscotch Panda, a practitioner of Tai Bo. I am none of those things, but and the person who waged the prank war is now my boss, so I can't really say anything about it. But that got me to thinking of what I want to talk about, because I don't really want to talk about being a writer, because I just sit at my desk in my pajama pants and bash my head against the screen for about 4 hours a day. And that's not very exciting. I want to talk about an aspect of writing and an aspect of my life, revision. This is my grandfather. I never met him before, because he died before I was born. He grew up in Quchao, China, and I come from a line of revisers. In his 20s, he assumed the identity of his dead brother to enter the civil service in China. And on my other side, this isn't a picture of my grandfather, but my other grandfather, he died at a very young age. I think he was hit by a streetcar. I don't really know exactly the story, in Guangzhou. And my grandmother had 2 children at the time, but they're both girls. And so she had to go to a village and pay a pregnant woman for her child. And if the child was a girl, she'd get her money back. But she had a boy, and then she adopted this boy, and then she had this elaborate ruse to make this boy a natural-born son, which involved my mom saying that she was a year younger than she is. I think that's how it is. I think maybe my mom just made up a story so she can be younger than she actually is. But my grandfather on my mother's side never worked a day in his life, because his own father moved to Canada during the gold rush. Not during the gold rush, but during the sort of CPR era. And this is not a picture of my great-grandfather, but it's a picture of August Jack Catalano. And what I find really interesting about him is he was a Squamish chief who lived in Stanley Park. He lived in an age before Stanley Park was revised by the CPR into this jewel of a park, and it was a place where people lived, and it was a place where people were buried. August Jack's father, Supple Jack, is still buried, I think, in Stanley Park, and I think August Jack remembers just sort of like eating breakfast one day when the CPR surveyors just sort of cut through his lawn, because they were just sort of just blazing a path through it, and they didn't really care. So this is my background as someone who just has revision in his lifestyle. I grew up in Vancouver, grew up in Ladner. I loved rock and roll. I loved Neil Young. What I loved about him was the fact that he refused to be pinned down. I think in an early part of his career, he became famous for Heart of Gold, and he described it as being in the middle of the road, and he preferred to be in the ditch. And I really romanticized being in the ditch, so much to the point that when I hit 30, I decided to go on a road trip that Neil Young went to on his route to stardom, just to sort of examine my own sort of rock fandom and to talk about how the kind of music and the kind of things that you inspired you as a young person sort of live on in your life, even when you stop listening to those records and you stop, wearing rowdy old T-shirts. Here I am at Hastings Racetrack. I've written 2 books about horse racing, and I'm probably the only person in the world who's written 2 books about horse racing who knows very little about horse racing. But what I came to learn was what amazing animals they are and what amazingly eccentric people live at Hastings Racetrack and sort of frequent the horse racing world. And I wrote a memoir about owning a racehorse named Mocha Time in 2009. And then I wrote a book about Northern Dancer, Canada's most famous racehorse, and it appeared last year. Finally, this is an image from my day job. And as far as day jobs go, it's easy street. I teach 2 days a week at UBC, and I also teach a little at SFU. Here I am in my lecture class at UBC, and what I talk about a lot is the idea of revision, of getting beyond your obfuscations, of talking about what you really mean, what you were really thinking when you did something, what a story really is about. This kind of revision is different from the historical revision of my ancestors, different from the revision of the CPR surveyors. But it's not necessarily an act of cleansing. It's not necessarily that you have to be pure to revise. You just have to acknowledge all your different deceptions. You have to acknowledge how you've changed in your life. And that's how you arrive at a truth. Thank you very much for listening to me.